Buzz.
This is a presentation I give to mostly northern beekeepers. And the goal is to give you a spring to spring snapshot of what beekeeping is here. And you'll see that we're between you and Fairbanks from a climate perspective, probably closer to Fairbanks. And just so you know, Dawson and Yellowknife are much, I'd say, 10-15% colder than Fairbanks. And we do have beekeepers up in Dawson, and the one fellow there, he typically gets most of his colonies through winter. And I guess that's the key. If you want the thing with the Yukon and Alaska is we have some early nectar flows that you'll only get if your bees overwinter, okay? Because it's really early in the season. And I'm going to go through feeding using pollen patties and some wrapping and a bit of disease and stuff managing. Okay, so let's start with the show. So yeah, my name is Etienne. I've been keeping bees now for about 15 years, mostly in the Yukon. And prior to this, I was in northwestern Ontario, north of Lake Superior, and I kept bees there probably 20 years ago. So as you can see, and the other thing is I like taking pictures and looking at what's going on in bees. And I will go through my wintering approach. So if you don't know much about the Yukon, so we're your neighbors. There's more moose here than people. So there's only about 40,000 people here. And we're, about the size of Sweden. And so there's no beekeeping rules, so we're all self-regulated. And there's about, 150 to 400 colonies now up here. We did have a fellow up in Inuvik who had some bees, but it was a bit too extreme up there to successfully overwinter because the season is crazy short. But he did harvest some fireweed honey up there. And let's see, we'll keep going. Like I said, I like keeping about 8 to 10 colonies because the one thing, especially in the interior, so I'm more in the interior, so Skagway is about 2 hours from here, an hour and a half. We're on the dry, cold side, and they're down on the coast. So the forest here, mostly pine, spruce, and aspen with lots of willow. And so we're very, pollen and nectar limited. So you can't have more than, I'd say, 3 hives per location or else you'll get nothing. So the more colonies you put, the less honey you'll get because you've just reached the limits of what nature can provide. I use all insulated colonies all year round. And my queens are a mix of carnies, some saskatraz, a mix of different things. I typically overwinter most of my colonies. I lose maybe one, and I'll go through why I lose the one every year. And it's a combo of nosema and this other disease that I've discovered. And I do occasionally treat for mites, and I stick with organic acids, and I don't use any miticides. So a key thing for everybody here, if you're not overwintering successfully, one thing you need to learn is to observe your dead outs. Understand why they're dying, and once you understand why they're dying and what were the probable causes, then you can actually head towards not losing your colonies. One of the key things is your colonies have to have enough stores. And up here, winter's like a marathon. So the key thing is it's heat loss equals more honey consumption equals more moisture generation. Okay, so for every pound of honey consumed, it's just under a cup of water that the bees have to manage. Okay, so you can see that if they're consuming lots of honey, because you have a lot of ventilation like down south, you're going to produce a lot of moisture. Okay, I'm going to show you some charts towards the end to show that even at 90 to 100% humidity, when it's cold outside, there's not much moisture in the air, and the bees have to add moisture to the air for them to have enough moisture to be healthy during the winter, okay, and not dry out. So it's a concept, that's a principle that folks don't get, that bees actually need moisture, but what we do down south, we overventilate, so the bees aren't able to manage inside the colony, okay? And I might swear here and there, I apologize, but one thing I'm gonna say around insulation and ventilation is, especially ventilation, I'll say it's poop or get off the pot around insulation. So some folks don't want to insulate, but they overventilate, or they insulate and overventilate. And I'll explain why that's not good. So it's okay to have some ventilation, but not too much. So for example, these are some of my spring clusters, and you can see how this was a couple of years ago, but in general, these are my colonies coming out of winter. And in general, they'll ramp up to be wonderful colonies, big enough for me to split in May. Like I said, my season is pretty short, and I'll show you how I actually feed pollen patties in March, when there's still 2 feet of snow and there's still cold temperatures. And there's a reason I can do that, is because I don't have to worry about my bees starving. In my 15 years of beekeeping, I've never had a colony starve, but I've always used a very insulated or low heat loss approach. Okay, and just to put things in perspective, my colonies in the Yukon consume less honey in 6 to 7 months than a colony down in Maryland does in a month and a half to 2 months. Okay, so you can just imagine how much moisture those bees down south have to manage, and then hence if there's too much moisture in the air, then they can't manage it, and hence the reason moisture kills bees if it's poorly controlled. So anyways, when you do lose bees, it's your fault. Okay, the sooner you take ownership in your failures over winter, the better you'll become, and you'll start understanding why your bees aren't making it. Okay, so yeah, sometimes there's genetics, there's all these different reasons why the bees don't do well. The thing to remember is you'll get a package. That package will have a stock queen in it. You have the option of replacing that queen over the season to make sure you have good genetics going into winter. Okay, so if you live with the queen that comes with the package and you say that queen is no good or it's poor genetics, you've made a choice. Okay, so again, it's the choices we make as we go through winter or through the season that determines how well you'll do over the season. A lot of times we don't have a consistent approach. We try a lot of different things every year trying to find that magic solution. So the key is to experiment and try little changes every year, and then you'll get there. So I've been tweaking my approach for the last 10 years, and I'd say that's the key, is I haven't made any big monster drastic changes. The only big drastic change that I did one season was go with an open ventilation and a screen bottom board, and all my bees died. Okay, and I can explain why and see things, because there was a multiple combination there. So again, regardless if you treat or don't treat, you need to be able to recognize disease and how many mites you have in your boxes. Okay, so I remember back when I did go to my last conference over there, I brought my microscope, and one of the beekeepers had brought some bees for me to test for nosema. And then he gave me the baggie full of bees. There was about, I don't know, 40, 50 bees.
It was John Christensen.
Yeah, I know. I didn't want to tell us.
Oh, it's okay. He would be happy for us to use his name. He
Okay.
told that story to everybody 100 times already. So
Okay, good. But anyways, there was more mites in that baggie than than bees. So I was like, John, I'm sorry, but mites killed your bees. Uh, and there's ways of splitting and doing brood breaks and aiming for good genetics to help you manage your mites. Uh, but like I said, initially I try to do that one treatment of oxalic acid right off the get-go when I get a new nook or new bees. And then after that, I'm usually good for a few years. Okay, so anyways, a lot of things you can do. And that's where having a bee club, a group of people that get together and sharing ideas, it's the best way for you to learn about the do's and the don'ts. So I'm just going to go through a few basics of what I do, and then I'll get into wintering stuff. As you get better, so I know some of you have been keeping bees for a while. As you get good, most of us can inspect a colony, a full colony, in about 5 minutes. Because we know we don't have to pull all the frames. Okay, so the goal for me is I usually pull 2 to 4 frames. I start from one side the 1 week, and I'll start from the other side the other week. I like using singles, so it makes inspecting colonies much easier. So I'm looking for brood, I'm looking for eggs, general health, I'm looking for pollen and honey frames. I'll do a tilt test to see how heavy that box is. And then I use screen bottom boards, so I have those trays. I pull the trays, and that tray can tell me a lot about what's going on in that colony. And I typically clean it 24 hours before I inspect, so it'll tell me freshly what's going on in there.
Etienne,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but can you explain them what you're using for a tray? I think most of them are using a different kind of bottom board.
Yeah, I'll show you on the next slide.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. So it's basically a bottom board with a screen with a plastic tray that fits in it that you can pull, and then you can observe the debris on that board. And the next slide is on that. So I usually do about 2 full inspections per season where I pull most of the frames, and I'll do that probably my first big spring inspection, because I have to clean the dead bees out, look for disease, and get a good understanding of what the brood nest looks like. And then I'll do one after pulling my honey, just to make sure it's in good condition to go into winter. And I'll do that early August. Okay, here's the tray. So basically this little plastic thing, it's like Coraplex, it fits in the bottom board, and any debris will fall through. So you can see that this was after an OAV treatment. You can see the mites. So it gives me an indication of how heavy, because the one thing with colonies, especially for me, I try doing those washes, but I don't get many many mites in my washes. But I'll do an OAV treatment and I'll get a drop. So now I've associated my OAV drop with the infestation level. The other thing is, with the tray, I can quickly spot chalk brood issues, white wax. So fresh wax is them building comb. So let's just say I put some fresh frames in there. I'll see some white wax as they're expanding. Brown cappings tell me the bees are hatching out. So one thing, especially in fall, when it's too cold to open the boxes up and you want to know if you were going to do OEV, you want to know if the brood nest is still there, because you want to do it with as small as brood nest as possible. One way of knowing is by observing these brown cappings. As you clean it, you'll see that the brown cappings basically take less and less space, because each of these lines is the space between the frames. And eventually you'll just get a couple of little cappings in the middle here, and it tells you, the brood nest is just about finished. So that's a way of knowing the size of the brood nest. The other thing is you'll get pollen dropping on here, so different colors, dead bee parts, ants. So once you start using them and looking at it, you can actually start connecting with what's going on inside the colony. So a lot of times if I have to skip an inspection, I can tell the general size of the brood nest because I'm too rushed. I don't have time. So I might just look at the inspection tray and only inspect the ones that I have questions about. One key thing, okay, I don't like using the word performance. So when you're overwintering colonies successfully, you have to assess your queen as soon as possible. So the reason I feed pollen patties early March through my special tray, my feed tray, so I can open the colony really quick without really disturbing anything. And I've got this little insulated tray on top where I could put my pollen patties and some fondant if I want to, and then close it back up, is I will do that usually sometimes 2 months to a month before first pollen. And what that does is it triggers brood rearing. I'm not worried about starvation. I'm not really worried about extra honey consumption. It goes up a little bit, but not much, because the heat loss is so low. Okay, so the one thing about brood rearing, the reason down south they lose a lot of bees in March and April is they're using wooden boxes with no R value. So once you start brood rearing, that colony, the heat loss goes up by 5 to 6 times. So it means they're consuming 5 to 6 to 8 times more honey just to keep the box warm enough for them to raise brood. Okay, when you're insulating your colonies, you're low ventilation, and you're not worried about, starvation, adding pollen patties in there, then it's just brood food. So it increases consumption by 1.5 times, maybe a bit more, but I usually have a good 50 pounds left in a double and about 30, 40 pounds left in a single. My singles go in with about 60, 70 pounds of honey, and my doubles go in with about 100 to 120 pounds. So they're consuming about half, not even half, in most of the winter, and then probably another 10 pounds. I do most of my feeding in fall. I rarely feed in spring because there's just so much honey in there, and I don't really have to worry about it. The only colonies I will feed are the newer ones or my splits, because I want that queen to really catch and start brood rearing, because I need a lot of fresh bees. So I'll do some feeding there, and I'll do some feeding if there's a dearth or anything like that. But that won't be till July or something like that, or in August, which is fall here. But anyways, performance. So imagine before this first step, okay, so this is usually in April sometime, so towards the mid to late April, but I've put a pollen patty about a month and a half before this to 2 months. So the bees have gone through 1.5 to 2 brood cycles already. Okay, so if I open that box, I should see cappings. I should see larvae, I should see eggs. Okay, so if I see really nice brood patches and a healthy brood nest, then my queen is doing pretty good. So I know she's laying. I have temperature sensors in all my colonies, so I know that the queen started laying just by the temperature. But this here, one of the reasons I put my pollen patties early is, one, to get a couple extra brood cycles, and the other one is so I can assess my queens early in the season. Okay, because my season is really, really short. And if I have to replace the queen, I need to do it really early. And the other thing is, our best nectar flow here is actually in June. It's, I'd say early to mid-June is all the Yukon native wildflowers, and it's the best honey in the world. So better than the Alaskan honey. No takers, eh?
They're all muted politely.
That's good. We can have our debates later. So, and then...
Can you take a peek at chat once in a while?
I will.
Okay.
And if there's any questions in there, please...
But we can also just circle back at the end. Like, that's kind of how
Absolutely.
I was assuming you could do it. Like, if you can't, like, I recognize that you got to a presentation to get through. So if we just put our questions in, we can also just circle back and address them all at the end.
Absolutely.
That's fine.
Sounds good. And then the next one is about 2 to 3 weeks after this is first inspection. So it's all about counting frames of bees. Is that colony growing? If it's bigger, good. If it's the same, you need to ask yourself some questions, maybe feed it if you have to, but it's about growth. And I find that a second year queen does really good here. So, and then a third year queen typically is not a bumper queen, but is a good resource queen. And that's a queen I'll be using in one of my nooks, just to make frames of wax, frames of honey, frames of bees, to supplement the other colonies. So that's what I do with my own queens, because no point pinching queens that can still produce bees and frames of honey and brood. Oops. Okay, third assessment, again, count frames of bees. And if there's a steady growth, then everything's good. If it's the same number or less, then chances are you have to requeen, because that colony is going to go in a dwindle, and you can wait, or you can just react and do something about it. Because one thing about beekeepers, especially when we first start, we try to save every colony and every queen and make them last as long as possible. But in reality, queens are at their peak the second year. And then the third year, they're probably on a dwindle. In smaller volumes, they still do decently, but I use them for resource queens at that point. And in red here, at some point, you need to learn when to quit, because just putting effort and time in colonies that just won't go anywhere is, you can spend your time in better places. So nutrition. So for example, this is probably mid-July pollen, and there's a mix of fireweed, there's some goldenrod in there, the darker orange is probably some late season dandelion. There's a few different things here, but there's a nice mix there. Versus probably later in July, in August here, all green. So good, bad. So I've found, and I'll go through a little bit there if I have enough time, but I did a honey study where I reviewed local honeys. I did pollen analysis and sugar analysis on a bunch of honeys here. And one thing with very pure fireweed honey, the bees don't overwinter well. And this is a beekeeper that follows the same approaches, same techniques, same everything, really good beekeeper, but he can't overwinter his winter, I guess his colonies effectively. And his main honey harvest, he's one of our commercial guys, he's got 30 to 50 colonies, has really good fireweed honey, lots of it, but he loses 80% of his colonies. Okay, so, and I find that if you don't have mixed color pollens, chances are you will struggle overwintering. Hence the reason I supplement from late July, early August. I start putting pollen patties on there, is because that's when my fall starts. And I need to keep that queen laying, and I need to make sure that that colony is getting the nutrition it needs. Okay, so lots of stuff here, but you just need to know when your nectar flows are. And like I said, here it's early summer, and then midsummer are both of our flows. The second flow is mostly fireweed and decumbent goldenrod, so it's like a tiny goldenrod. We don't have much clover here, or sweet clover. So most of it is native flowers. Places that do have sweet and Alsip clover, they'll get a later nectar flow. Especially for a beginner, you need to understand your flows and how long your season is, because each one of these, you'll have different actions and things you need to do. because reacting when the leaves are changing in the mountains is too late. So you need to actually start doing things when you see fireweed. Chances are right after fireweed, yeah, you might get some late clovers here and there, but this is the end of peak nutrition in the north. And there's things you need to start doing. And usually, I'd say interior Alaska, it is the same as us. So basically by the end of July, early August, you need to start thinking about winter. I actually start thinking about winter in May. And everything I do during my season is based about what do I need to do to make sure my colony is ready for winter. Okay, I don't get big bumper crops here because I'm very boreal forest. I get 25 to 50 pounds per colony. But like I said, it's the best honey in the world. But like I said, I love beekeeping for the bees, but also the science and the learning. So I invested 20 bucks, I think it was, in some cheap pollen collectors. And the pollen is actually not to collect pollen for me or for my bees. It's more for me to collect here and there every couple of weeks for a few hours, just to see what's coming into the colony. Okay, what's the mix, early season, what's the volume? And it just gives me a good indication of what the nutrition the bees are getting. And the other thing is I walk my dog all the time, or I did, and it allows me to walk around my property, around my location, and pretty much see my bees because I'm the only beekeeper here. So if I see a bee on a flower, it's my bee. And I can see what color pollen it has and all that type of stuff. So it's important for you to understand your local forage and the cycle. Let's see, like I said, I feed pollen patty in early March, and I feed pollen patty late July until probably the first week of September. The one thing to remember is if you keep feeding pollen patties, you will not have winter bees. Okay, a winter bee is a pre-nurse bee. For it to become a winter bee, it cannot raise brood. So if it raises brood, basically it's aging. And that's those dead bees in early winter that die in front of your colony. A lot of those are the late season summer bees. But to have winter bees, basically at some point you need to stop feeding pollen patties and you have to stop the brood rearing cycle. Okay, so my bees here were living almost 300 days, but my spring clusters were really, really small. So by me feeding pollen patty in March and then into September and then stopping, what it does is it guarantees that I have a decent population of winter bees prior to the really cold. So usually the hard cold here starts usually I'd say late September, early October, if we're lucky, mid-October. So like the ice rink is ready by mid-October. And the lake nearby I can walk out in October. So I need to give those bees about a month for them to not brood rear so that I've got a good, decent population of winter bees. And then by me feeding in March, what it does, it reduces how old those winter bees are. Because the one thing, once you start feeding pollen patties, that colony is going to instantly start brood rearing. Okay, and I've got temperature sensors to prove it. So, and I guess there is a connection between health and nosema and pollen diversity. Okay, so the more diverse their diets, the healthier your bees are going to be. Okay, so if you do start collecting pollen patties or collecting pollen just to see what the mixes are, and you see that it's just a single color, that's not good. So it's important that our bees get good nutrition. The other thing that happens up here is, especially after the first frost, typically our first frost here is early August. Last year, we didn't even get 30 days frost free. So pretty much all summer we were getting frost. Luckily, not so many hard frosts, but in August we got our hard frost, and what that does is you get a lot of rust on the plants, and then the bees will start collecting that because I guess it looks and feels like pollen. It's the only thing out there, but it's not good nutrition. So one way to mitigate rust spore collection is by using those pollen patties again from late July, pre-first frost. Okay, so it's important that you do it before the queen slows her laying down, or else you get this bouncy thing. Okay, so this is before I learned to start feeding pollen patties here. So if I would have fed some pollen patty here, the line would have been straight across. So this is the brood nest temperature. So this is about 95 F, 35 Celsius. And you can see flat line here tells me that it's brood rearing. Once it starts dropping, it tells me that the queen is slowing down. There's less open eggs. And you can see me adding pollen patties, spikes it up, spikes it up, spikes it up. But if I would have put pollen patties here, it's a nice flat line across. So it's something I've learned over the years to actually start feeding pollen patties before they run out, or else you'll get a bouncy season like that. I got a lot of material, so I'll skip some of the stuff. So again, I'm a bee geek. I have a microscope. I try to support everything I do or say with science and facts. And this is just an example of some of the grains in here. Looks like this under a microscope, and it's actually this orange stuff on the roses and on the bottom of our fireweed. So, and then down here in the background, these are nosema spores with some of this orange stuff, and these are rust spores. So anyways, one key thing is you want a lot of honey in that colony going into winter. Okay, so this is just an example of a brood frame, but you know how the bees always put honey around the frames like this, and then they start building down. If you understand how heat works, heat rises. And a lot of times where this honey is, it's pinched out. And I'll show you on the next slide. So what you're trying to do is to have nice, fat honey frames that the bees can use to help manage the heat rising by just having a few bees across the interface here to actually slow that heat from flowing out of the cluster. So we got to help those bees out. And the other thing is, as the colony shrinks in late summer, fall, this brood nest shrinks. And this is where we need to give them something to fill those cells up, especially if there's no nectar flow. And chances are up here, we don't have nectar flows. So what I do is typically after I pull my honey, usually the first week of August, I'll give it a 1-to-1. Okay, so I'll give them about 2 liters, so a half gallon to a gallon of 1-to-1. And that's just to give them a nice flush of liquid feed before I start the bulk feeding. Okay, so remember there's a pollen patty on here too, and it's just to make sure I get a really good cycle of 2 of brood in there. If you were going to use any supplements, that's where you would do it also. If you're not using supplements, then don't worry about it. Just use 1-to-1 sugar syrup. Once I finish that, chances are they'll consume that in probably a day or 2. Then what I'll do is I'll go and I'll give them another 2 liters, so a half gallon of 2-to-1. And then I'll just see how quickly they're taking it. And chances are they'll probably take it down in a couple of days. And then after that, I'm going to start bulk feeding. Okay, my feeders can take about 2 to 4 gallons. So I'll give it a good 2 gallons. And then you'll see, then the bees will really start piling the honey on. And my goal, so a lot of times my colonies coming out of, I don't take any honey out of my brood boxes. So they're almost at weight. And the feeding that I do about 22 pounds worth of 2-to-1, 1 bag of sugar. And it's just to backfill this brood nest as the queen is leaving or stops laying eggs. And pretty much by the end of August, early September, I'm done my feeding. And then at that point, I might just continue trickle feeding just to keep them going before the deep freeze kicks in. I don't do candy boards anymore. I don't put fondant or anything like that because I found the bees don't consume it and it's just waste for me. So I just don't do it anymore. Practical implications. So again, lots of honey in the box, like this pinch here. So if you looked at the frames, usually the honey pinches out like that. So it's a nice choke point. So it's where the bees could actually easily just, again, heat rises. And I've got pictures where I put my thermal camera looking upwards into the cluster, and you can see that basically the heat, a lot of heater bees in the bottom here. So it tells me that the heat will rise and then it gets pinched out and the bees are able to block it off. So that's why a lot of times we'll have big clusters on top here, and it's because it's easier for them to manage heat that way. If you have any empty frames that haven't been drawn out, take them out. No point having that in the box. Replace them with follow boards, with styrofoam, wooden follow boards. Replace that volume because the bees will have too big of a space to keep warm. So it's critical that you don't give them too much space. And in a nutshell, this is what I do. So early spring, I do my cleanup. I've already added pollen patties in March. I assess my queen. I start moving my honey frames to the outside. Early June, typically there might be some cap brood, and I'll move the cap brood in the bottom. Any drawn out honey frames, I'll put them in the bottom box if I'm using double hive management. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm preparing for winter. Okay, because bees will be able to draw out stuff in the top box much easier than in the bottom. So by me doing this, basically I'm getting ready for winter. So chances are they won't consume this. And what it does, it creates a bigger brood nest in the top box for the queen to lay even more eggs. Late July, again, just check the brood size nest, general health, store levels, add pollen patty. Weekly, like I said, 7 to 10 days, 14 days, depending on if I have time or not. I just do quick inspections. I do, like I said, use OAV. So I'll do one in early spring and in August just to check mite levels. Sometimes I might I have medium frames in a deep box so that the bees actually put drone comb in the bottom of those mediums. And then I'll pull the drone brood and have a look at the mite levels under the cappings. So most of my colonies now will swarm if I don't do anything. So in the beginning, my location, it was really hard to get them to swarm because for me, swarming is good. It tells me I can do a split. If you can't get your bees to swarm, it means you're not doing something right. And then in August, like I said, I start with 1-to-1. I do use Hive Alive in some of my colonies, some that show higher signs of nosema. And then I switch to 2-to-1. And then, like I said, early September, I'll do my last bulk feed. And in a nutshell, that's how I manage my bees. Okay, so I'll skip over this one. But if you I'll go here and I'll explain what my failure mode, how my bees die in winter. Okay, so I've discovered through my microscopy, it's confirmed with the lab now, that my bees have a combination of nosema and this amoeba disease. Okay, amoeba disease, what it does, it infects these tubules, this organ in the bees that helps them manage moisture. It's like their kidneys. So basically, my bees are getting kidney failure because of these round cysts. And then you throw in nosema, and then it's just havoc. So literally, I was noticing piles of dead bees, and then next to it would be a colony with hardly any dead bees. And every year I've been noticing the same. So I have a feeling that the transmission point was actually the equipment. I was reusing equipment because you read literature, they say, yeah, you can reuse nosema infected equipment. But the key thing that was missing is I have a feeling these cysts survive winter and they're not good. So hence the reason that if you see piles of dead bees and you have somebody with a microscope, I'm hoping the labs will start to be able to test for amoeba. So I've been sharing some of my samples with a few labs so that we can actually start testing Nosema and amoeba at the same time. And it seems to affect Nordic type beekeepers more than folks down south because our bees don't have cleansing flights. So if a bee with Nosema, so with issues with their guts, issues with water management because of these cysts, basically they really have to go and they'll go inside the colony. One thing about in the Yukon, we get a lot of honeydew honey. Okay, honeydew honey is low energy and high content that the bees can't digest. So it's like a triple whammy. You throw Nosema, you throw the cyst, and then you have honeydew, and then you have colonies that die. And that's what seems to happen to me. But it's only one colony in 10, so it's like 10%. So it's not big, but I'm a perfectionist. I don't want to lose any colonies. So I'll skip that. And then I'll go into climate. So you can see this is my landscape around my colonies. So it's important for you to understand what's around you and what's possible. Luckily, the forest here in June this is all lingonberries, little bush cranberries. So my June flow has a lot of lingonberry nectar in it. So it makes really interesting flavor. I'll skip that. In a nutshell, this is my summer. So these bars is how hot. So if you're familiar with growing degree days, if you're a gardener, or you do HVAC, so the blue is the opposite of growing degree days. So it's like cold degree days. And the red and the green is growing degree days. So this is not too far from where I live. And because I was down in Knoxville, this is their summer on the same scale. Okay, so you can see that my July is like their April. Okay, so you can see how when you take beekeeping techniques from down south, understand that their conditions are completely different than ours. Their timing, the length of the season, and you can see like my May is almost as cold as their winter. Okay, so it's those things that I've been looking at to try to compare apples to apples and using conversions. And for example, a colony here, so because Knoxville, Maryland is to the east of here, not too on the coast. So basically my bees consume less honey than these folks for this same period of winter. And you can see the magnitude colder our winters are. And that has to do with ventilation and the lack of insulation when the colonies start brooding. So one thing for us, it's when the colony is at its most stressed, typically in March and April for us, it's when we have the biggest temperature swings outside. Okay, so that's why if you're not insulated, you've got a lot of ventilation, you can't feed pollen patties early like I do. If you're well insulated, you have low top ventilation, and you've never starved your bees out, then chances are you can feed pollen patties in March and you won't have to worry about it. Okay, this is all of wintering really confused in one slide. And it's just to show that for you to winter, you need healthy bees, you need plenty of food, and then you need to understand your wintering method. Okay, and that's what I've been doing over the last couple of years, is to try to figure out what all the drivers, all the interconnections of what wintering looks like. One key aspect a cluster of bees actually produces 5 to 20 watts of waste heat, regardless if it's clustered or not. Just a bee at resting, if you took, I forget what it is, 18,000 bees at rest, produces 8 watts of energy. Okay, so if you top vent, most of that heat will just get lost. So it's wasted heat. Okay, but if you don't top vent like me, but you ensure that they have, I guess, plenty of ventilation in the bottom or air to pull from, then all that heat is collected and stored in the honey. So that's why when they have a lot of honey, it's thermal mass. It's a place for that waste heat to get stored versus just be vented out. So there's 2 types of clustering. Okay, so in the winter, so if you don't insulate, the bees will cluster. So their mantle, their envelope of bees is what they need to do. So the envelope of bees here is what they need to do to keep the heat inside this cluster. Okay, because the box here cannot hold any heat. Any heat that escapes to the environment. So the temperature here equals outside. Okay, so this blue area here, I call it cluster driven, because that's what happens. So these bees are clustered and it's linked to the outside temperature. In polyhives, or if you insulate and wrap and use minimal top ventilation, most of the bees are actually loose most of the winter. Okay, they'll be clustered, but it's a loose cluster. And they'll be more clustered in the bottom of the box than on top, because the bottom is where the cold exposure happens. Okay, and you can see there's almost 20 degrees Celsius difference in clustering temperature. So that tells me my bees are more relaxed, they're less cold stressed, and basically their metabolism is closer to resting, which is much healthier than the bees having to, because it's metabolic aging. Okay, so because we need our bees to survive a longer winter than down south. So it's important that we give them everything they need to be able to make that winter. The one key aspect too is the number of bees to the volume needs to be, you want them tight. Okay, so the bigger the volume, the less the bees, the less effective it'll be. It's the same for this box here, but it's important that that volume of bees, the volume to bees, be as small as possible so that each bee can heat a smaller space, if that makes sense. So this is just an example of, I think this was last winter. So our average temperature was about -20, which is what, -5 Fahrenheit or something like that. And that was the average. This was the temperature inside my box. So 12 is, was it 50 Fahrenheit to about 70 Fahrenheit. You can see the average there is around 15. The hottest temperature is just over 20. So from the low 70s to the, I guess in the 70s to the low 80s is what the temperature in my boxes were. So you can see the bees are comfy there. And they don't consume anymore. That's a misconception. The principle that I'm following is, again, you want the temperature inside to be much higher than the temperature outside. Why? Because that's what drives natural ventilation. Okay, so if the temperature inside equal the temperature outside, like it does in this here, you will have minimal natural ventilation. Hence, you need a lot of ventilation, like upper ventilation, because the air is not moving. But in this context here, the bees are able to generate a nice natural convective current. Okay, so why I use the hot hive principle is basically because my bees won't cluster until really low temperatures, and they won't actually peak until like -30 at their tightest. No top ventilation, because for me heat loss equal moisture, more moisture to manage. So my goal is to minimize the amount of heat loss, minimize honey consumption, and minimize the amount of moisture the bees have to manage. So I use a lot of top ventilation because that's where most of the heat gets lost, is in top. And I'll show you a picture of how I do that. I know condensation will happen because we had minus 55 Fahrenheit this winter, and it was about minus 40 to minus 50 for about 3 weeks to 4 weeks. So condensation will happen. It is what it is. So I want condensation to happen below the cluster. So I have less insulation lower in the box than I do on top. And that way the condensation will happen below the bees. So I just use R10 to R20 on my side walls. I'm not stuck to size. So like I said, I actually like wintering singles the best. I've got the best success. I think I've overwintered close to 40 singles now, and I've got maybe 90% success on that. Doubles, I'm around 75%, and 5-frame nooks, I'm at probably 70% success for 5-frame nooks outside in the cold. So again, T in versus T out is to maximize natural convection. I use slatted racks, and what it does is the cluster or the bees are better able to manage their heat, and the temperature average is higher when you use a slatted rack, and that just has to do with heat loss. Has nothing to do with consumption. It's just a more effective way of them to manage their temperature. Key concept is I need heavy boxes. Candy boards don't hold heat. It's emergency only. So I need real honey or sugar syrup honey that's capped, and that's for thermal mass, and it's to help buffer temperature changes. I only use a bottom entrance, and it's about a ½ inch high by 2 to 3 inches wide. And most of my bottom boards are actually open all winter. And that's so that any excess condensation can drain out the bottom, and I'll show you how that's set up. So there's no direct wind that can get in there. And it's like a crawl space below our cabins. So if you have skirting, so I have a skirted area below all my colonies that I can pile snow around so that there's a nice, I guess, warmish crawl space below the colonies. Again, I have to minimize the number of, I have no cleansing flights, so I have to manage heat loss, or else my bees will poop in the colony. And bees can actually heat inside of the hive under the right conditions. And I'll show you, I think I'll have enough time, like a slide where it shows the bees at minus 40 outside. They bring up the temperature to like 25 degrees Celsius, which is like 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And they heat the whole box at that temperature. Again, I've got sensors. I'm not even there. So this was overnight. And I have like 20, I had, I think, 20 sensors in that colony. So I could measure temperature all over the place. And the bees were actually heating up the whole box, which is incredible. With no disturbances and no squirrels around. So like I mentioned, you need to understand that, especially if you use insulated colonies, you don't have to worry. It's the volume of the box is regardless. It's number of bees to the volume. And for example, this box here is full of insulation. So what I do is I put 6 inches of styrofoam in a medium or a deep box, and that's my top. And then I add the regular top, and basically this whole thing is just insulation. And same with my singles. I've got R40 to R30 in each one. And same with my 5-frame nooks. And you can see here that colony here, I don't have the next picture, but you can see how I put filler boards and a piece of pine board here to protect this colony. Okay, so I moved some frames of brood into this box, and then this was in mid-August. And then by September, these 2 frames of full brood hatched out, and then this box was just brimming with bees, which was great. So this is my winter setup. So the key to reduce exposure to the environment, I hug I bring all my colonies together. You can see that this here is a double, this is a double, this is a single, this is a single, this is a 5-frame nook. And you can see how I just put lots of styrofoam, I tape the seams. Because once colonies get cold, the bees aren't able to propolize those seams. So it's important that if you crack colonies open in winter, you've broken the propolis seals, and the bees will not be able to seal that up. Okay, and any cracks is like open ventilation. So you take the volume of all those cracks, add them together, and that's the effective ventilation that you've created. Hence the reason I agree with what Tim said is don't open your boxes. It's critical. The reason I open my boxes in March is I open the top and then I pull these pieces of styrofoam out, and now I have this insert in the bottom of the medium or deep. And you can see how I have a slot in the middle here, and that's the same size as a pollen patty. And what I'll do is I'll put 2 pounds of pollen patty in there and then fill the top with fondant and then just close it up. And then they'll be good for about a month and a half. There's still plenty of honey, and then that colony can just go and prosper and make lots of fresh bees for me when I open the box. And then they'll be ready for a split in May. You can see how I lean pieces of plywood on my front entrances, and that there is to protect against the wind, and it's actually to manage my cleansing flights. Because bees, when they have to go, if the sun warms up the front of that colonies, bees want to cleanse, they'll go out and die in the snow. But they can hold it in much longer. So I do this, and what it does is I can manage the cleansing flights, and it protects the entrances from snow and plugging up. Each of these things here is a screen bottom board that's opened up into this space here. Okay, so there's plenty of air down there, so the bees will never run out of air in case the bottom entrance here ever got plugged. The bubble foil wrap is to create a shell of dead air around these colonies, and that's to prevent wind chill. Okay, so wind chill is the rate of cooling. The temperature is not colder. Okay, that's a Weather Network thing. It's to sell advertisement. So the temperature is not colder. It's just the rate of cooling increases. And if you have too many seams, cracks, places where air can get through, that's where you'll increase the heat loss. So that's why I use bubble foil wrap around my colonies, and I tape the top here. It's to prevent the effect of wind chill. Because when it's minus 55 with a 10-kilometer wind, it's cold out there. So it's probably minus 70, minus 80. So this here ensures that the rate of cooling, the bees in their boxes will stay comfy. Pieces of plywood will prevent any direct wind from reaching that entrance. So that's how I manage my bees in winter. So this is how they do it in the prairies. So folks who don't use polys, they use wood colonies. That's what they do up here. And they do successful. So basically it's R40 on top with R10 on the side. The only difference is they do use top entrances, but they only have a 3/4 inch entrance in the bottom. So if you want to use top entrance, just make sure your bottom entrance ain't too big. And it's the balance. That's how you manage to flow through your top hole, is by the size of the bottom hole. But if you go too big on top and you have too many broken seams, then you'll get a lot of flow through heat through that colony. Okay, so we call these prairie wraps, and it's what the commercial beekeepers out in the prairies use. And the guy up in Dawson, that's what he does, and he gets 90% success rate. But the key is he's got healthy bees, lots of bees going into winter. And the thing about Dawson and Fairbanks and those places, it's actually warmer there than it is where I live in summer, but it's colder in winter. So Yukon honey, which will probably be very similar to what you get. I'd say yours is probably the second best in the world. But you can see this is year to year, different places in the Yukon. You can see a lot of different colors. And if some of these dark ones, those are the ones that you can tell they're honeydew. And the reason I know they're honeydew is I had it tested and now I can observe it in my microscope and I know what it is. And I know what they're consuming, the different flowers. And this is what a fireweed honey looks like. But in places where it's like pure fireweed honey, you'll just get fireweed pollen and not much of everything else. So the honey is actually really low in amino acids and a lot of different things, which tells me that they're probably deficient in some important chemicals and nutrients that is probably making it so they don't overwinter well. That's a theory, and I'm hoping to prove that in the next couple of years. I'll skip that, and let's see, we'll go, hopefully you don't mind me going, I should be done in the next 10 minutes. So this here was just, like I said, I don't say things that I haven't tested, and I've tested slatted racks now for the last 4 years, and say this blue line here is pretty much the size of the cluster. So this tells me the cluster is bigger, so less tight, than a colony with no slatted rack for the same temperatures. Okay, so I've, over the last couple of years, I had half with slatted racks, the other half without, and then a bunch of sensors in them that tell me the size of the cluster. And this has been the general trend. So literally the temperature below the cluster is warmer, and the size of the cluster is much looser in the ones with the slatted rack. Okay, so again, folks down south use IR cameras to tell them where the cluster is. I use IR cameras to figure out where my heat loss is, okay, the way it should be. I'll skip that. Just so you know, insulation and how it works. So wooden colonies, most of the heat loss is through the roof. And folks who use wooden colonies in in summer, one thing I do recommend is make sure you insulate your lid year round, your top, okay? It'll help with honey consumption, so it'll mean you'll get more honey. It'll help your bees during the heat waves. We get the occasional one. And it just means that the bees will better be able to maintain their brood nest, okay? Because most of the heat loss, again, is on top. In winter, if you don't insulate the top, that's where the chill point is, and that's where you'll get your condensation. So they've started learning that, yeah, I can put a little piece of styrofoam here. For them, it's 3/4 inch to 1 inch is plenty. The colder you get, then you get into the 2-inch stuff. Would be the minimum I would recommend for somebody down south. Again, if you're going to do top ventilation in insulated colonies, because remember that temperature difference. Okay, so if it's really hot in here, it means you're going to get a lot of through flow air going. So I don't recommend a screen bottom board if you're going to top ventilate, because you're going to get too much ventilation. Trust me, I tried it and it was bad. So you want to manage the size of your bottom entrance. So usually a couple inches in the bottom to a 3/4 inch hole equivalent on top. In the north here is plenty good. And again, so the condensation, moisture will flow out. That's where you get all the hoarfrost at your entrance. And if condensation happens inside, it tends to happen lower in the colony, which is fine. My case is lots of top insulation. Condensation happens low in the box, hence the reason I want the screen bottom board. So any moisture just flows out and doesn't, I guess, stay in the colony. And then you get air mixing in the bottom here. The cold air coming in, the warmish air coming out, and you get a nice mix of air, so heat exchange. Like I said, 18,000 bees produces about 8 watts of energy. basically 2,000 bees at 13C will produce 12. What does that mean? It basically means that basically this is heat. The more heat, the more honey. So it's all about metabolic rate. They're aging quicker, consuming more honey. They're creating more moisture, and they'll be accumulating more poop faster. And that's the key to things. Reason I like sugar syrup is it's pure sucrose. Okay, there's very little stuff that the bees can digest in there. And the conversion rate to heat is really good. So if you have typical honey that you don't have much honeydew, which is great, then you'll have a honey with this much sugar. But if you have honeydews, you'll get honeys with a lot less glucose and fructose. Really good for humans, especially for people who have sugar problems, because it has a lower glycemic index. But it's not good for the bees, because it means there's a lot of complex sugars in there and stuff the bees can't digest. And a lot less energy for the same amount. Excuse me. So it means they need to consume more honey to produce the same amount of energy. Hence the poop factor and them pooping everywhere. Okay. So this is just numbers on the slatted rack. One thing I did notice, especially with, because folks think you can't overwinter without top ventilation, but bees are smart. So this was me taking a picture from underneath into the cluster. So this is my profile with my temperature sensors. This line here is, you can see there's no bees. So I call it a vent channel. Okay, so the temperature is much cooler. And you can see here the temperature's in the mid 70s. So the way air works is hot air rises and then it cools and then it drops. And that's what happens. So, but bees create this natural vent channel on the side for the air to circulate, and that's what natural convection is. So it's a theory, but my temperatures and my readings, and I've got a snapshot every hour of this, which tells me that's what's going on. This is a picture of the seam in the middle here looking upwards. And you can see that the bees are like an inch away from the slatted rack. So they're pretty much right at the slatted rack, which tells me it's a nice big cluster and they're loose. And you can see there was hot bees walking around, and I was like, oh, cool. That's what it looks like. So we're almost there. So condensation is only a problem, or moisture is only a problem if the water condenses out. And that's what moisture is. So moisture is water, vapor in the air. Warm air can hold more moisture. And dew point is where that vapor condenses out. So some of these polys, and sometimes we put these wooden shims here and there, we call those heat sinks, or not heat sinks. It's a heat sink, but a thermal bridge. And that's where your condensation will happen. Okay, so that's the reason I tape a lot of my seams. I don't use any of these shims anymore because that's where my condensation will happen. And you can see here these sensors popped in and they stuck out. So the cold air would come in, and you can see some mold here, some black mold and white mold. So that's that. So now my sensors, I just chopped this tab off and I just have the sensor with no plastic thing. And that's to make sure that there's no air infiltration coming in or out. And we're almost finished. So like I said, I've got 4 or 5 years of data since the first time. 2017 is when I started collecting data. This here is the level of moisture the bees want in their cluster. Okay, so we call it absolute humidity. So it's a value. It's grams of vapor or water per cubic meter of air. And you can see it's pretty flat. This gray line here is how much moisture is in the outside air. Okay, typically for us, we get 70 to 90% RH outside. And this is what the line looks like. So the difference between the red line and the gray line is how much moisture the bees have to add to the air for them to stay healthy. Okay, so there's a misconception. Moisture and condensation doesn't come from outside air. It comes from inside water that the bees generate. But bees need moisture. So if you have too much ventilation, what you're doing is you're making this line lower from where the bees need it to stay healthy. So the bees are actually starved, or they're thirsty, they get dehydrated. So it's important that we manage that. And this is just one of those examples where it was say, this was the typical cluster. It was minus 40 outside. And then within a couple hours, they started heating the inside of the box. By 6 p.m., the whole box was hot. And then temperature by midnight was starting to drop again. So if you understand dew points, so you can see that the bees are generating crossover points here, so condensation points, so on the sidewall. But the thing to remember is that water is 70 degrees, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's nice drinkable water for the bees. So they're actually generating moisture. And you can see how the green line, this is them heating the box, little heating events here and there. So it just tells me that the bees are able to add moisture to the air, and they're able to create condensation if they need it to help moisten the air or if they're really thirsty. Because the thing to remember, at minus 40, there's almost no moisture in the air, even at 100% humidity. The air is almost dry. Okay, so it's critical that, I guess, we provide the bees with moisture, and it becomes more critical the colder it gets. This is just a picture of thermal lag. The blue line is outside temperature, and then these green line is temperature sensors in a box without bees. And this is just the impact of honey and how it helps regulate these swings. We saw that. This is just proof that the bees can ventilate at minus 40 and colder. And this is just a temperature sensor. I'll skip that. And the one thing is, if you do use top entrances, put little guards on your top entrances, okay? Because it doesn't take much wind for the flow to switch, okay? And the reason it switches, especially when you have low insulation, is the air inside is not moving. There's no energy in that air. So a bit of wind will flip the flow of that air. Okay, so this is in the prairies, northern Saskatchewan, and what they do is they put little cardboard guards, waxed cardboard guards on their entrances because it's really windy there, and it's to prevent this from happening. So they call it the wind versus stack effect. We talked about wind chill. And I guess just food for thought, if you use candy bars, are you taking too much honey off, or are you feeding enough in the fall? So when you put the bees to rest for winter, how much empty space do you have around those bees? Okay, so at a minimum, consider top insulation year round, and it'll help with the heat stress, and it helps with, I guess, heat loss in the winter. So for us up here, I'd recommend at least our 20 to 30 in the top, and you can just use an empty poly box and just stuff it with styrofoam. Do you understand how condensation works? How much have your bees ever starved? Do you worry about it? And how much honey do your bees consume? Do you understand why your colonies are failing? And do you understand how old your winter bees are? And what does that cluster look like in the spring? Okay, so if your cluster is dead in the spring and you haven't opened that box all season and they're all wet, it has nothing to do with moisture. Okay, it's just the temperatures fluctuating over time, and those bees are natural sponges for condensation, and they didn't die from moisture. They probably died from something else. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing. And Hopefully you're still there.
I am.
Yeah.
And I just want to say,
Thank you.
I want to say thank you, Etienne. That was just really spectacular. I know Etienne did his own introduction, so I still want to say a few things. I studied so much when I first started beekeeping, and I watched every beekeeping video out there, and I went to classes with Nathan, and my first winter, I started seeing things that weren't consistent with some of the stuff that I had been taught, and then my second winter I really saw it, and then I heard Etienne's research where he's you're putting how many temperature sensors in each colony, like 17, 19?
Yeah, I think the most was like 26, but
Okay, so a lot. And where it really lets him say what happens inside poly boxes, and it exactly mimicked what I was seeing. And it just helps me understand it more. And then, the more I listen, and by the way, I'll put the link to Etienne's YouTube page on our Facebook page. He has a lot of videos about how he does this and looking at his bees. And I just think it's been really great. So yeah, thank you. So we have some questions, and if anybody else has a question, get it in the chat and we'll make sure we get to it. So go ahead and pop it in there. And if you're good, Nathan and Valerie and Etienne, is it okay if I just kind of walk through the chat questions with Etienne?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
go for it.
Okay. So some of these questions are mine, and I think you answered one. You talked about the visual observations of the brood cappings when they're diminishing, and I wanted to know if that correlated to reduced hive temperature from your temperature sensors.
I would say it would.
I wonder if that's one of the things that helped you recognize it when you were seeing it.
I read an article in, I guess, who was it? It's the apiarist. He's like a guy out of the UK. He writes really good, he's a scientist, but he writes really good practical articles. I'll send you the link to his blog. But he had, I'd been using it, but he actually put a nice article around that topic. So like I said, I do have temperature sensors, so I can tell when the queen slows down. But it does match what's on the screen bottom board, and I never actually connected both of those because my
What?
brain. Oh, I did connect it, but in the sense that because I had two inputs and they both said the same, I just use one or the other.
I see.
If it makes sense.
It does. So I have a question about adding pollen patties in March, and what I've often done, just kind of guessing and putting things together, is I didn't add pollen patties until I saw the temperatures were going to be consistently above 40, because I assumed that it was going to increase how often they needed to take cleansing flights. But it sounds like you aren't worried about them you're adding it without regard to that.
Yeah, so typically, like this year, I'm gonna gamble. I'm going on an overseas trip for about a month for work for most of March. So the day before I leave, which is March 5th, hopefully it's warmish outside, and then I'll pop and put 2 pollen patties with some fondant on top, because I won't be back till April. So it's a gamble. Usually I wait for some warmer temperatures where I know the bees will be able to do like a semi-cleanse. But there's other folks here that just put the pollen patties on a warmish day in March and then don't worry about cleansing issues. And I have a feeling, again, it's the misconception that, again, down south, once they start brood rearing, their honey consumption goes exponential. But we don't have that problem if you're well insulated with low heat loss. is just brood food. So it's not like because they're converting a lot of that, especially I use the global patties. I don't use, it's about 15% real pollen. And like I said, I usually like waiting till a first cleansing flight or a warmish day so that the bees can actually go out and poop, and then I start. But like I've done it without that and they were okay. So it is, I'd say for here, there's a slight gamble, but I've never seen a problem. So I'll be able to report back in mid-April when I get back with, was it good or bad? But I've done it 4 times now, mid-March, with no issues.
And I must have missed that. I didn't hear you say before that you usually waited until a cleansing flight. And then that does make sense. But I mean, if our bees have been holding it for 5 months, giving them stuff that's going to fill them up even more does seem counterintuitive. But you're saying that they don't actually ingest or digest a lot of it. They just convert it into brood food.
Yeah, and that's maybe because they're converting their fat bodies now also to brood food. So there's something going on, and I guess I'd say usually mid-March, there's never been an issue with or without the cleansing flight.
When you add pollen patties in the fall, how many? Can you ballpark, like how many pollen patties you're using for each colony?
I use about a pound, like
just one,
a pound
really
per colony, so 1 patty. And then last, I'd say if there's a dearth or frost, they'll consume it in about 5 days to a week. And then I just probably add 1 a week. And if there's
So you keep adding them like all of August and then stop in September?
Yeah, I just make sure that there's always some pollen patty in there, and it lasts a week to 9 days. If there's a bit left, I'll add a full 1. If there's half left, I may just add half of 1, just not to overdo it. So it's about a pound at a time.
Okay. I'm going to come back to, and Jamie asked any specific pollen patties, and I believe you use the global pollen patties, which is what Nathan and I use as well, and the 15 to 20% pollen.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll come back to Warren's first question. The slatted rack comments, I wanted to understand more. So I'm using what I'm calling a winter shim, essentially below my bottom box, a couple inches, and which is essentially a slatted rack without the slats.
Yeah.
And so I think what I heard you say was having those slats in there helps them keep heated as opposed to just empty space.
Exactly. So, because if you take the surface area of the slats and that front piece, I think it reduces the open space by like, was it 56% or something like that, 58%, depending on the gaps and stuff. So it reduces the open area, and what it also does is it creates drag, friction.
Okay.
So
sure.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it's wood, so it is wood is better thermal sink than styrofoam or open air.
Or air, yeah. Okay. Warren asked a question. I'd be interested in getting your feedback. What's the best time of year to requeen a hive when a queen is old? And we have such a short season. I'm curious about when you start. Let me just broaden the question to say, what are the markers you look for when you're trying to split your hives or requeen a hive?
Like I said, early on, I had difficulties getting my bees to swarm. And now it's the opposite. I actually have to manage swarming, which is good. So what I look for, and it's typically, it'll be early June, sometimes late May, mid-May if I'm lucky. But the challenge with mid-May is the queens aren't available yet. So last year, what I did is somebody convinced me to buy Carpathian queens, and 75% of them basically got rejected. So they laid about a week of eggs, and then they got superseded. And then I had swarm cells in there. So, but on good years, I'll just buy Saskatraz or a good mutt queen from BC, and I'll do it in June, late May, June. Like they start rearing queens there. So by June, I can get some good northern queens that I can use to requeen and do splits. My doubles coming out of winter are for the June honey, and my singles are for the July
So he
honey.
requeens
And
late June, July.
No, it has to be. I put
So I have to buy a queen
Yeah.
and find this one in
early June, late May, early June is when I requeen, because July is too late for me.
and that's right when you're having the peak of that early flow you have, right?
Yeah, and that's why I manage a combo of singles and doubles, so that my doubles, I can split down and pull off 5 frames and create put the old queen, take a new queen, and then they should be good if the queen starts laying right away to actually still get me honey.
And you have the only bees around, so you can't really do any open mating.
I do. And that's where, like, I've mated, sometimes in the beginning I had like big, really beautiful swarm cells, and I take a frame with really nice swarm cells and take some resources and make a 5-frame nook, and then just go put it in one of my other yards with another colony. And I've 6 for 6, 8 for 8, where they always mate and they always survive like 3-4 years. So it's, I think the drones are healthier up here too, like, and that includes yourselves. I think our drone population, we might not have the same mix as down south, but if you've got a good base genetics, they will mate with, say, 2 colonies.
So do I. I'm done.
Okay. I think that's the only questions, unless I missed something. Does anybody else have another question they want to ask Etienne?
Yeah, are you using nukes as well? Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, I make my own. So I've
you
got 5-frame boxes, styrofoam boxes, and
Yeah.
when I do my splits, I'll split a double and I'll take 5 frames out of 20 to build a nook, and then I'll take the old queen, put it in those 5 frames,
Right.
and then put the new queen in the big box. And that way, there's a good chance that they're still going to be able to produce honey, and that's how I guarantee my growth and not have to buy bees every year.
And is you mentioned did you say Carpathian queens?
Yeah, the Ukrainian queens I tried, and basically most of them failed, so I don't think I'll do that again.
Gotcha.
Do you ever try to get honey from your nukes?
I wish.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I do now is I always keep a pollen patty on them, and I always keep some feed on them all year round. So that way they're producing honey frames, like sugar frame honey frames for winter. They're producing brood, they're producing bees, and they're my backup queen. If I do lose a queen, then I have a backup queen.
Great. Okay.
And
Cool.
so you have that screen bottom board, but do you leave the corrugated cardboard in there most of the winter?
No, it's actually open all winter.
Okay.
And it's closed in the summer.
Okay.
So when there's brood, I want it in because it's easier for them to maintain. But
Yeah.
in the winter, it's to drain any of that excess condensation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to get back a lot. I've used candy boards a lot up here, and I know you don't. And my observation is that most of the time they don't eat a lot of the sugar, but once in a while they do. And I'm going to just share a screen here real quickly.
Because I was going to say, if your boxes are really light, say in April, then I'd say probably. But if your boxes are still heavy and there's still 30, 40, 50 pounds of honey in there, then the bees are just, they're just snacking out.
No, so I tend to agree with you, because generally what I've found is that there's a lot of honey left in the spring, and a lot of sugar that didn't get eaten. But maybe every year 1 to 2 will look something like this in mid-February. That's about a third gone, you'll see. So they're, yeah, anyway. And I'm guessing you could see that okay.
Yep.
And it's just very, very interesting to me that colonies that I think, I mean, maybe I forgot to feed them as much as the others, because the others have just, they're really not touching it at all, just barely.
Yeah, and I'd say the key is how much honey is left in that colony.
Do you think, my curiosity would be, is if they just had more Italian in them than some of the others.
It could be that too, yeah.
Because that's what they tend to brood up when they shouldn't be brooding up and going through resources more. And that was another question I was going to have. One of the things I always was taught was that, the bees are always raising some brood all winter long.
And she goes, "What's in here?" And I just looked and I realized.
Let me figure out who is.
It's Warren.
Okay, hang on. There we go. Thank you. And now that I've had temperature sensors for a couple of years, I don't think our bees raise brood all winter long. What do you think about that?
Very little if they do. So usually about this time, you can start seeing little step changes in the temperature. But I'd say very minor, because the reason I know is like literally an hour or two after I put that pollen patty, the temperature goes steady to 95 F. It goes from 20, so what is it, 20 Celsius to 35. It's almost instant.
Wow.
And then it goes flat. So I know that just having that one pollen patty just triggers it instantly. And it also tells me if the queen is there. Because if it doesn't trigger it instantly, temperature-wise, sensor-wise, then I know that, okay, that colony is likely without a queen or has queen issues.
That's very interesting. So I'm going to show you one more thing here. So this is the temperature sensor for the hive you looked at that's eaten a third of their sugar about.
Yep.
And the sensor is in the candy board. So it's up above. That's why it's so cold in the 50s. And it spiked up 20 plus degrees. And I think that's when they got on the sugar, because they got closer to the sensor. So, I mean, that's just my theory, is that it was isolated from the heat down below Reflectix inner cover. By the way, do you use Reflectix inner covers now?
I do have some of them. It's like above my feeder tray, I do have a Reflectix thing, but it's, I'd say I do have some, but it's not standard across.
So anyway, just getting back to the temperature, I've seen some of these heating events randomly throughout the year, and this one is that one that where I think it's pretty obvious what happened. It went up pretty fast over the course of a couple of days and then stabilized, and they're up there. So I'll have to give them more sugar, but it's only one of 14 colonies. So
yeah, and I'd say my question to you would be in April is what's the honey level in that colony? If
right,
it's low, that because that'll answer your question.
Because if it's low, then either they ate more of it, or maybe I missed a feeding, perhaps.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And finally, those broodminder sensors, they work just fine if you cut the tag off.
Oh
that
yeah,
tag is a pain.
It is. I cut them off, and I put basically if you cut it about an inch from the end, like the
sensor
temperature
end?
one, yeah, from the sensor end, there's plenty. You just use packing tape to seal the bottom of it if you want to change the battery. And then for the other ones, I just put a piece of packing tape on the cut end so that the bees can't get in there and no direct moisture can get in them. And as long as there's little cracks here and there, that's all they need for the humidity sensor.
Yep. Okay. There's only one last question. It's about the what's our opinion of Apamiae hives? Have you used those, Etienne?
No, I was speaking with at Hive Life there, the owner, and
Yeah, Cayman likes them.
And I did buy their bottom board with that pollen thing built in just to trial it because it seemed really easy to collect pollen. Those Amazon yellow things, they're cheap, but they're kind of annoying. So I did buy one of their bottom boards, and when I was there, I was talking to them, and they were asking me my advice about how to plug their top entrance. And because they're having issues, people are just plugging up their entrances, and they've redesigned their feeder to look more like the one I made. So it captures and holds the heat in there more. So it looks like I said optics wise and culturally, they're going to leave the top entrance there, but they're going to give control of top ventilation now to the beekeeper so that they could actually plug it and have zero top ventilation if they want.
We've got a guy that runs, I want to say he's got about 40 or 50 Jeremiah Fry of the Apamiae hives, and he's very happy with them. He said he buys about 10 more every year.
Nice. Yeah, and like I said, there's a lot of knickknacks. If you know how to use all the little tools on it, then I'd say that's the key.